but you'd have no deficit. No worry that you're going to be taxed to cover it. No need to cut your social programs. None of it. The rich people would have had to pay 10% of their stock and bond portfolio. Over the last 30 years, the people with stocks and bonds have done much better than everybody else. They've had the best 20-year run in the history of the United States stock market. So you'd be going to the richest, less than 1%, those obviously most able to pay, and those who have done the best in the last 30 years, and you could have gone to them and said, as a patriotic, loyal American, is the least you could do. Pony up, 10%. And that takes care of all the stimulus we want, and it won't put the government into one nickel more. So when anyone tells you, we have a terrible deficit, we have to cut the government spending, and we have... Stop. That's like being accosted on the street by someone who says to you, I am now going to give you freedom of choice. You can choose whether I stab you or choke you. And you all know that the answer to that is, I don't accept the range of options. And when someone tells you that we have a deficit and therefore you either pay higher taxes or we spend less on social services, you answer again, I do not accept these options. I would like to stick it to these people. That's what I would like to do. And that would solve our problem. We would not have a deficit. And by the way, these are the richest people in the world. Their consumption expenditures will not significantly change if you tax their wealth. Every economist who's ever done macroeconomics knows that. For those of you that had those courses, remember you learned something about the marginal propensity to save. Right? The marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to consume. Basic idea. The poorer you are, the more of your income you spend. The richer you are, the less of your income you spend. Why? Because you're rich, and you don't need to. It's very complicated. The rich people will continue to spend because their spending has never been conditioned by their wealth. And if you think it is, it's because you're not one of them. It may hurt your feelings, but it is the truth. Okay? That's the way it works. So there is no rationale. Could the Greek government solve its problems? Of course it could. The Greek government could solve its problems if it taxed wealth. Greece, the wealth in Greece is highly unequally distributed. There's a relatively small part of the Greek population that is extraordinarily wealthy. What about them? What about them? In Greece, the problem was what I told you. Politicians, by the way, right-wingers, left-wingers, make no difference. They all borrowed the money and spent it. When Greece became part of the European Union, everybody felt, okay, they're part of the European Union, all those rich countries, France, Germany, will back them up. So we'll lend to the Greek. Wonderful, the Greek government said, solve all our problems, keep lending. We'll keep the masses happy by giving them money and not taxing them, giving them programs. The rich will be happy, we'll give them what they want, we'll never tax them. We borrow, we borrow, we borrow, we borrow, we borrow, until the day came when the lender said, hey, this is getting out of hand here. At that point, the Greek government could have made a decision. And that was, okay, we have to cut back on our lending, our borrowing, excuse me. And the way we'll do that without hurting the spending of our government is to raise taxes on the rich. Could have done that. You might even have expected it. The Greek government is a socialist party. The party of PASOK is a socialist party, runs Greece, won the election. They're in power right now. The austerity, the raising of taxes on the average Greek citizen, and the cutting back of government programs and government employment, which is severe in Greece, is being implemented by the Socialist Party of Greece, whose leader is a man named Papandreou, who comes from a long family of Papandreous. His father and his grandfather were leaders of Greece. So it's an old, established, political, leftist family. Okay? Yorgos George Papandreou, the current prime minister, was a student of economics at Amherst College in Massachusetts. And while there, took courses from me. How the world functions. I taught him.
You should have done a better job.
I should have done a much better job. I was invited and I went to Greece in May of this year. Right in the middle of all the crisis in Greece. I gave lectures at the University of Athens. And at a certain point, the professors who invited me learned, I don't know how, that I had been the teacher of the prime minister and told me that I might not be allowed in. I don't know what you say under those moments, but I decided I would go, and the worst that they would do is they would not let me into the airport, and then I'd go somewhere else in sunny southern Europe and have a nice time. But there was no problem. I went in, nobody bothered me, and I gave my lectures at the University of Athens, in which I said all the things I just have said basically to you. Yeah?
You were describing the difference between Ireland and Greece.
Yes.
Do you continue?
Yes. I wanted to set the background of Greece because it's so like the United States. Ireland is a little different situation. Ireland, the problem begins with the banks. It's not really with many other players in the Irish scenario. Not that the other parts of the Irish economy were not involved, but it begins with Ireland's entry into the European community, using the euro as its currency and so on. And Irish banks therefore become capable of borrowing on very attractive terms all through Europe. And so they borrow like crazy, and they lend inside Ireland like crazy to all kinds of businesses, to all kinds of home buyers and so on. A big boom lasts for several years, fueled by the arrival of a number of big multinational corporations that set up production, drug companies and others in Ireland. A real boom for a while. But it's a boom fueled by these banks who, it turns out, were borrowing. They were not doing what conventional banks do, take deposits and lend them. They had such a boom in Ireland that they quickly lent out all their deposits. There were still lots of borrowers in Ireland they wanted to lend money to, so they began to borrow massive amounts of money in Europe to then relend inside Ireland. And they did that with the usual imprudence that characterizes banks. So a few years ago, when the crisis begins to happen around the world, Ireland discovers that the banks have lent wildly inappropriately to companies, to developers, to homeowners, and they can't possibly begin to get all of this back. Which means the banks announce that they don't have any money. It's just like the story I told you about panics in the United States, which people come to the bank, I want my deposits back. Only here, the depositors, think of the depositors as big banks in France, Germany, Britain, even some here in the United States, who lent at wonderful rates to the Irish banks, who in turn lent it out at crazy rates to people who couldn't possibly pay it back. So now the banks are about to fold. Well, you could have let them fold. But if the Irish banks folded, people began to notice and began to look. How much had the Irish banks borrowed? Then your mind got blown. They had no limit. They had borrowed more than the entire economy of Ireland. They had borrowed wild amounts of money. And so if they folded, all of the major banks in France and Germany and many in England would have collapsed because they would now have money that they had lent out to the Irish bank that they weren't going to get back because the Irish bank couldn't get it from the people it lent it to, so they couldn't repay the banks they had borrowed from. So the big banks in Europe went to the European governments and said, you can't let them fail, because to let them fail is to screw us. So we want you, the government of France, Germany, Britain, and so on, we want you to bail out the Irish banks so that we don't go down with them. But the European government said, we can't do that. We're sticking it to our own people. What will it look like that I'm closing schools? I don't know how many of you saw a few weeks ago, there were huge demonstrations in England by students furious at the fact that they're cutting back the public universities in England and jacking up the fees that have to be paid big time, huge amounts. So the students are in this. You cannot survive in British politics if you're sticking it to your own people's children while bailing out a defunct Irish bank. Forget the history of England and Ireland, although you shouldn't. It's relevant here. It's relevant. But the idea that the British are going to bail out the Irish bank while sticking it to their own children, not a good politics. It's a weak government, Mr. Cameron. He has a hard time surviving under the best circumstances. This is his death. So that's real quick. We have to bail out the Irish banks, but we can't be seen to do it. Here comes the punchline. Here's what we've got to do.